Hello, everyone, and welcome to Counterpoint. I'm your guest host, Michelle Simard. Today's episode is about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and why you should care about it. Yesterday afternoon, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that Russia could invade Ukraine any day, launching a conflict that could come to an enormous human cost to Ukraine. According to Sullivan, the attack could happen as soon as tomorrow, or it could take some weeks. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky plays down the Russian invasion, despite the U.S. sounding the alarm bells. U.S. officials say the Kremlin has assembled approximately 110,000 troops along the Ukrainian border. Russia denies that it is planning an attack on Ukraine, and European countries push to defuse the crisis. French President Emmanuel Macron heads to Moscow today, seeking to de-escalate the situation and push for a peace plan. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz heads to Russia next week. The crisis in Ukraine flares up every so often, and the tensions it creates affects people, businesses, and the markets. The UN Secretary General has made clear that there can be no alternative to diplomacy and dialogue. Military intervention by one country and another would be against international law and the Charter of the United Nations. The UN has urged all actors to refrain from provocative rhetoric and actions in order to have diplomacy truly succeed. We as Canadians hear the news about what's happening in Ukraine all the time, but it doesn't resonate with us at the same level, such as events that happen in our own country or those to the south of the border. Today, I want to discuss why Canadians should care about what happens in Ukraine. And to help me discuss this issue, we have Orest Zakydalsky, Senior Policy Analyst at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Hello, Mr. Zakydalsky, and welcome to Counterpoint.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming. Now, let's get right down to it. Why should Canadians care about what happens in the Ukraine?
Well, I think the first thing to mention is that Canadians should care about what happens in Ukraine because Canada is a part of the international community. European security is important to Canadian security. Canada, of course, is a part of NATO, which Ukraine is not, but Russian aggression against Ukraine threatens not only Ukraine, but also the European continent. And so it should be an issue top of mind for Canadian security. And of course, Russia is not only Ukraine's neighbor, it is also Canada's neighbor. And so this is something that, Canadians should keep in mind as well, that, a country that is an aggressor state against another country, Ukraine, is also our neighbor and frankly, our adversary as well. So, from a Canadian security perspective, what happens in Ukraine and what happens with Russia are certainly very important.
Okay, can you give our viewers a little bit of a background to the Ukrainian crisis? Because obviously this happens every so often, and I was thinking our viewers might want to get just a little bit of a background.
Sure. I think the first thing to remember is that the Russian-Ukrainian war has been ongoing for 8 years. So this current flare-up and this current crisis is not out of nowhere. This is part of a war that Russia has been waging against Ukraine for 8 years. In February 2014, Russia invaded Crimea, which is southern Ukraine, and occupied Crimea. And then in spring of 2014, invaded the two eastern Ukrainian oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk, parts of which are still under Russian occupation. In that war, about 13,000 people were killed. Over 30,000 wounded, 1.5 million internally displaced in Ukraine. And there's fighting daily on the line that separates Russian troops from Ukrainian troops in eastern Ukraine. So this is not a war that may start. It's a war that started 8 years ago and has been ongoing since then.
I agree. And not only that, wasn't it in 2015 that the Belgian government had determined that it was a Russian missile that had knocked down a Malaysian airplane around Ukrainian airspace?
So in 2014, in July, a Malaysian flight MH17 was flying over eastern Ukraine and was shot down by what has now been determined to be a Russian Buk missile system.
Hold that thought. Hold that thought. We're going to come right back. Welcome back. So, Orest, prior to the break, you were discussing the airline the crash that happened, and you were going into details. Can you please elaborate on that?
Sure. So in 2014, in July, a Malaysian airliner MH17 was flying over eastern Ukraine, where it was shot down by a Russian Buk missile system that came from a Russian army brigade in Kursk Oblast, and it was part of the Russian invading forces in eastern Ukraine. It was a civilian airliner on which 298 people were murdered by Russia. There's an ongoing trial right now in the Netherlands where many of the citizens who were on the flight were from. So there's 5 states that are part of an international investigation that has put 3 Russian nationals and 1 Ukrainian national who was working with the Russian forces on trial for shooting down this airliner. It should be noted as well that at the UN, Russia vetoed an international investigation that would have been done under the auspices of the United Nations. And so the Netherlands, Ukraine, and 3 other states formed an international investigative team, and the trial is ongoing now.
Yeah, and to go to that point, so it seems quite clear to many people that Russia, has a large stake in the international arena, especially since they have a veto power, and a lot of things that they do, at least what they claim they do, is to the benefit of the Russian people. And so right now, President Putin claims that he has to protect the Russians that are living within the Ukraine. He has to protect their rights and their safety. And so it really goes down to this. He says, I'm not going to invade Ukraine. I'm just having troops there, and just in case, and so forth. So my question to you is, do you think that he does this as a form of a psychological warfare? Or perhaps as a ruse or some other kind of distraction for the West, so they're not paying attention to something else? Like, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, I think when he says he's not going to invade Ukraine, he already did 8 years ago, and
but he says he's not going to do it again.
Well, he also said he didn't do it 8 years ago. So, I mean, to believe him at this point would be, the highest of folly, I think. So, I mean, why does he present things the way he does? I really don't know. I think it's partly a part of exercise in internal messaging to his own citizens, and partly an exercise in creating some sort of deniability, plausible or not, so that people in the West and in other countries who do not wish to confront Russia on its behavior have some sort of excuse not to do it. So I think there's, but that, again, that's my feeling. I don't know what his calculus is.
Well, of course, I don't think any of us know. I mean,
what
really.
I do know is that he is, he stands at the head of a state that has been waging war and killing Ukrainians for 8 years. And I think that, the response to that has to be stronger in the West, and there's got to be a lot more deterrence to a further invasion. I know you mentioned President Macron is going to Russia
today.
I mean, talks are good, but they need to be backed up with real deterrence. Otherwise, the chances of actually getting Russia to stop its aggression are slim to none.
Yes, no, I understand. What you're saying is there needs to be bite to the bark. We can't keep saying that you shouldn't do this or this is not appropriate. What we need to have is some real consequences. And right now, what we have is talk of consequences. We have the UN saying, well, there shouldn't be any type of provocative rhetoric or anything to incite other parties, other actors in this crisis to move unexpectedly. But really what it comes down to is that what truly is going to be a consequence if a war did occur? Because as we know throughout our histories, when things get charged, there sometimes only takes a spark. World War I started from a spark, from killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And because all the other superpowers were supercharged, we ended up having a great world war. And so at the end of the day, this is what could happen here. But before we go back into that, we just need to cut off for a break, and we'll come right back at you. Welcome back. So Orest, as we were just talking about, we were talking about like how a spark, a little thing could ignite a war. And you know, for at this particular juncture, while all parties and the United Nations have said they're going to try to not allow a war to happen, and at the end of the day, it still could. It could be simple as a soldier tripping and his gun shooting, and then another comes, and next thing you know, we have fighting that happens, and nobody knows who started it. So what's at stake if a war did occur?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to remember is that there's only one side that's escalating here, and that's Russia. Ukraine is not escalating. The West is certainly not escalating. They are, seeking dialogue and seeking diplomacy, as is Ukraine. So it is not incumbent on both sides to de-escalate. It is incumbent on Russia to de-escalate if Russia truly doesn't want a war. Now, what would happen if there were a war? I mean, I think the consequences for both Ukraine and for Europe, and frankly for Russia, would be devastating. I mean, you would have, in the case of a full-out invasion, you would be looking at millions of civilian refugees, destroyed cities, and a strong resistance from both the Ukrainian army and then an underground resistance that would follow. I mean, Ukraine has one of the stronger armies in Europe, and so the Ukrainian people are ready to fight for their freedom and defend it. And so it would be a war that has not been seen in Europe in 6-7 decades, and that would be devastating, I think, for everybody. So now the way to avoid that is to raise the cost of invasion to Russia. So the two things that we believe that Canada and our allies should do immediately is to provide Ukraine with more defensive weapons and to place sanctions on Russia now rather than in the event of a further invasion. So not to threaten sanctions and then put them on once Russia invades and it's too late, but put them on now and then remove them for a verifiable de-escalation of the situation. And the provision.
And not to cut you off, but a verifiable de-escalation would be something to the effect of take some of those 110,000 troops away from the border, correct?
Well, or all of them.
Pardon?
Or all of them.
Or all of them, yes. Of course. All of them would be ideal. But you're saying at the end of the day, there has to be some form of action upon Russia that would show that they do want to de-escalate. And while all of them would be fantastic, because that would be very clear, may not be the case. But what you're saying is, if we decided to take some form of action that would have some type of effect, as going back to the euphemism that I gave, that the bark needs to have some bite. What you're saying is, as you stated, we need to raise the cost of that invasion. And one would be that provide Ukraine with more defensive weapons, and two, put the sanctions on now as opposed to putting them on later. And if we put them on now, then having some form of de-escalation with having some troops being removed would be a step in the right direction. Because I highly doubt that Russia would take all troops back, but they would take some. And if they did, perhaps at that point we could consider that as some form of cooperation, and that maybe we could have more discussions, because really we don't quite know what Russia totally wants at this point. It's not on the table because, again, we have a blanket denial. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think the most important thing to do is to make the cost of war more expensive to Russia than the cost of peace. And so the way to do that is both economic sanctions, personal sanctions on people close to the Russian president and the inner circle of Russia's regime, and also to provide Ukraine with defensive weapons. So we had this past weekend, on Sunday, actually yesterday, rallies in 30 cities across Canada, calling on the Canadian government to provide Ukraine with defensive weapons and to stand with Ukraine. And so we've seen the Americans, the British government, Poland, the Baltic states, several others providing those weapons, and we are calling on Canada to join our allies in doing so immediately, and also to work together to come up with a deterrent sanctions plan to deter Russia from a further invasion.
Welcome back. So during the break, Orest, we were talking about some of the protests across Canada, and I thought we could discuss what else should Canadians do in order to help the Ukraine.
So there's, I think, two things. One, we would ask that people write to their members of parliament and tell them that they support Canada providing defensive weapons to Ukraine and strengthening sanctions against Russia. It's important for members of parliament to hear that message from Canadians. We've seen polling that says that the overwhelming percent of Canadians support both the provision of defensive weapons to Ukraine and increased assistance to Ukraine. So that's one thing we would ask that people do. The other is that both the Canada-Ukraine Foundation and the Ukrainian Canadian Congress have formed a humanitarian relief committee. So there is information on both the website of the UCC and the Canada-Ukraine Foundation about how Canadians can donate in support of humanitarian efforts in Ukraine. So those are the two things that we ask all Canadians to consider doing to support Ukraine in its fight for its independence.
Yes, I agree. But the counterpoint to this is that Russia keeps claiming that it isn't having any form of aggression, and it's there just to protect its own people and their rights. So we have one side, and then we also have the president of Ukraine saying that we don't really need to be super concerned, as the way the US describes it. So right now we're having a little bit of a shift, and we're getting mixed messages here. But and to that effect, it's like, how important is it? That's what it really comes down to, because I think we hear these stories being reported all the time throughout the news through different various media sources. And at the end of the day, how serious is it? The US says it could be imminent any day, or it could be in a couple of weeks, or it could be a couple of months. What really is at the heart of it? And really, why should Canadians care?
So I think at the heart of this issue is the international rules-based order and the sovereign right of nations to choose their own destiny together. And so what we have is Russia trying to reassert and reestablish the Soviet and frankly the Russian Empire before it, and dominate the countries that it used to colonize. And so the struggle of the Ukrainian people to maintain their independence is at the heart of the principles that we as an international community have agreed on. And
that being the freedoms and liberties that are accorded to a free and democratic society.
To all nations and their right to choose their own common destiny together. And so I think that we should care not only because of geopolitics, but because this is a fight for the principle that we as Canadians subscribe to and hold dear. And that is the the Ukrainian people's right to their independence and their right to choose with whom they form alliances.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Orest. It was very interesting, and I really value your opinions. Hopefully our viewers will listen and they will contribute. Many of us know that the cost of war is great. The age of disruption is upon us, and our established institutions that are constantly being tested or disrupted are on the brink of collapse. The balance of power in this world is constantly being challenged for supremacy. To keep a modicum of stability in the world, war must be avoided at all costs. Ukraine declares itself a free and democratic society that wants to provide freedom for its citizens, freedom that us in the West value, but also sometimes we take for granted. Canadians should care about what happens in Ukraine because it is the testing ground for future challenges. And if we want to preserve the freedoms and liberties that we have, we need to preserve the freedom and liberties of others who have been challenged, especially those of our allies. Canada entered the world wars not because we were being invaded, but because our allies' freedom was being threatened. And if they lost, our freedom would have been threatened. Freedom means self-determination, which leads to enhanced expressions of creativity and original thought. With these, we get increased productivity and an overall higher quality of life to achieve the true potential of who we are. And if that freedom is ever under threat, is it not our responsibility to remember that thousands of others gave their lives to help protect ours?